You think you know the Soviet Union? Sure, everyone knows the basics, like Cold War, communism, and Red Square. But the USSR was 70 years of bizarre secrets, unexplained incidents, and mysteries that still don't have clear answers. Some of this stuff sounds like conspiracy theories until you realize it's documented historical fact. Let's go down the rabbit hole of Soviet mysteries that most people have never heard about. Buckle up, because this gets weird. Let's start with something that sounds completely made up but isn't. The Soviet Union had a secret city that didn't appear on any maps. Actually, they had dozens of them. These places were called closed cities, and they housed scientists working on nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and other classified projects. The most famous was Arzamas 16, where they developed Soviet nuclear bombs. The city had tens of thousands of residents, factories, schools, and hospitals. But officially, it didn't exist. Mail was addressed to post office boxes in nearby cities. Birth certificates listed fake locations. If you told someone outside the closed city system where you actually lived, that was treason. The really wild part? These cities were often nicer than regular Soviet cities. Better food in stores, better housing, better everything, because the government needed to keep nuclear scientists happy and productive. So you had this parallel Soviet Union where educated elites lived in comfortable secret cities, while everyone else stood in breadlines. And nobody could talk about it. The Soviet government admitted these places existed only in 1992, after the USSR collapsed. Imagine living your entire life in a city that officially wasn't real. Then there's the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident, which happened in 1959 and still freaks people out today. 9 experienced hikers died in the Ural Mountains under circumstances so bizarre that conspiracy theories have multiplied for decades. Their tent was cut open from the inside. They fled into freezing temperatures wearing minimal clothing. Some had massive internal injuries with no external trauma. One was missing her tongue. Soviet investigators concluded they died from an unknown compelling force, which is possibly the creepiest official explanation ever written. Theories range from avalanche, to military testing, to infrasound, to indigenous people, to aliens, to secret weapons. The Soviet government sealed the case files for years, which obviously made everyone more suspicious. Recent investigations suggest it might have been an unusual avalanche combined with panic, but the missing tongue and strange injuries still don't have satisfying explanations. The fact that this happened in the Soviet Union, where information was controlled and investigations were secret, means we'll probably never know the full truth. Speaking of things that sound like fiction, the Soviets tried to create ape-human hybrids. Not as a joke, as a serious scientific project. In the 1920s, a biologist named Ilya Ivanov got government funding to artificially inseminate chimpanzees with human sperm. The goal was creating a new species of super-strong workers who could labor in harsh conditions. When that didn't work, he proposed artificially inseminating human women with ape sperm. The government finally shut him down, but the fact that this got official approval and funding tells you something about how weird Soviet science could get. The Soviets also experimented with telepathy, mind control, and psychic powers with complete seriousness. The KGB had entire departments investigating paranormal phenomena because they were terrified the Americans were developing psychic spies. They tested whether people could transmit thoughts telepathically. They investigated whether humans could influence matter with their minds. They looked into remote viewing, where supposedly you could psychically see distant locations. Millions of rubles got spent on this stuff, and the programs continued for decades. Did they find anything? Officially, no, but the files remain partially classified, which keeps conspiracy theories alive. Here's something that definitely happened but still seems impossible. The Soviets moved entire cities. Not the people, the actual buildings. During World War II and the Cold War, when the government decided a factory or research facility needed to relocate, they sometimes picked up buildings and moved them hundreds or thousands of miles. Entire wooden houses were disassembled, transported on trains, and reconstructed in new locations. The scale of these relocations was absolutely massive, involving entire industrial complexes moved from Western USSR to Siberia and Central Asia. The Soviet biological weapons program is another rabbit hole that gets darker the more you learn. The Soviets signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, promising not to develop bioweapons. Then, they immediately created the largest biological weapons program in history. The program, called Biopreparat, employed over 60,000 people at its peak. They weaponized anthrax, plague, smallpox, and designed entirely new diseases. The facilities were disguised as pharmaceutical factories and vaccine production centers. The scary part is what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. Thousands of bioweapon scientists suddenly found themselves unemployed in a collapsed economy. Where did they go? Who hired them? What knowledge did they take with them? Western intelligence agencies spent the 1990s frantically trying to track these people down and offer them legitimate employment before someone else recruited them. The full story of Soviet bioweapons still hasn't been told because much remains classified in Russia and the West. Lake Karachay is another Soviet legacy that sounds too awful to be true. It's been called the most polluted place on Earth. The Soviets used it as a dumping ground for nuclear waste for decades. The radiation levels got so high that standing on the shore for 1 hour would give you a lethal dose. In 1967, a drought exposed radioactive sediment, and wind spread contamination across thousands of square miles. The Soviet response? They eventually filled it with concrete blocks and covered it, essentially creating a giant radioactive tomb. The area remains dangerously contaminated today. The mystery of Soviet submarine K-129 is still not fully explained. In 1968, this Soviet ballistic missile submarine sank in the Pacific Ocean with all hands lost. The Soviets couldn't find it, but American intelligence located the wreck. What happened next sounds like a spy movie. The CIA launched Project Azorian, building a massive ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer that was supposedly for deep-sea mining, but was actually designed to secretly recover the submarine from 16,000 feet below the surface. Did they succeed? Officially, they only recovered part of the submarine before the lifting mechanism broke. What was in that section? What did they find? The full story remains classified. The Soviets never admitted what K-129 was doing when it sank. Theories include colliding with an American submarine, accidental missile detonation, or even a rogue crew attempting to start World War III. We'll probably never know the complete truth. Here's something verified, but still bizarre. The Soviet Union had a doomsday device called Dead Hand, or Perimeter. This was an automated system designed to launch nuclear missiles if the Soviet leadership was wiped out in an American first strike. Sensors would detect nuclear explosions and leadership communications going silent. After a predetermined time, the system would automatically launch a massive retaliatory strike without human input. Essentially, the Soviets built a real-life version of Dr. Strangelove's doomsday machine. The terrifying part? Russian officials have suggested the system still exists in some form today. There's an automated nuclear weapon system that could potentially launch without human authorization, and we don't know its exact status or capabilities. Sleep well with that information. The Soviet Union also conducted secret nuclear tests in ways that seem insane by modern standards. They detonated nuclear weapons to create artificial lakes, to excavate canals, to collapse oil field fires, to create underground storage caverns. This was called nuclear explosions for the national economy. They set off over 120 peaceful nuclear explosions for various industrial and construction purposes. The environmental damage was catastrophic, but the Soviets were convinced nuclear explosions were just another industrial tool. One of these peaceful explosions created the Chagan Lake in Kazakhstan, which is now radioactively contaminated. Another series of explosions was supposed to create a canal connecting rivers, but the project got abandoned after significant radioactive contamination. The full extent of damage from these experiments is still being discovered today. The mystery of what happened to Raoul Wallenberg is one of the most frustrating Soviet secrets. Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews during World War II by issuing them Swedish passports. When the Soviets liberated Budapest in 1945, they arrested Wallenberg as a suspected spy. He disappeared into the Soviet prison system and was never seen again. The Soviets claimed he died in 1947, but evidence suggests he may have lived much longer in secret prisons. Why did the Soviets arrest a neutral Swedish diplomat who was clearly a hero? What happened to him? Why did the Soviet government lie about it for decades? Witnesses claimed to have seen him alive in various prisons through the 1970s, but Soviet authorities denied everything. After the USSR collapsed, some files were released, but they raised more questions than answers. His fate remains officially unknown. The Soviet space program had disasters they covered up for decades. Everyone knows about Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. But cosmonauts died before Gagarin's successful flight, and the Soviets simply erased them from history. Valentin Bondarenko died in a training accident in 1961, but the Soviets didn't admit it until 1986. There are persistent rumors of lost cosmonauts who died in space before Gagarin, though solid evidence is scarce. What's verified is that the Soviets absolutely covered up space program failures and deaths to maintain propaganda value. The Nedelin catastrophe in 1960 was one of the worst disasters in space history, and the Soviets kept it secret for decades. A prototype missile exploded on the launch pad, killing at least 126 people, including top military officials and engineers. The explosion was so intense, it left shadows of bodies burned into concrete. The Soviet response? Complete denial. They invented cover stories for the dead. They classified everything. The disaster wasn't officially acknowledged until 1989. Here's a mystery that combines science and paranoia. The Moscow Signal. During the Cold War, American embassy staff in Moscow started experiencing mysterious health problems. U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviets were bombarding the embassy with microwave radiation. Why? Nobody knows for certain. Theories include attempting to activate Soviet bugs inside the building, conducting medical experiments on Americans, or trying to interfere with U.S. communications equipment. The American government knew about this for years but didn't tell embassy staff to avoid creating an international incident. When it finally came out, there was huge controversy about whether the exposure caused cancer and other health problems in diplomats and their families. The Soviet motivation remains unclear, and both governments said as little as possible about the whole thing. The mystery of Soviet gold is another rabbit hole. When the USSR collapsed, massive amounts of gold and other valuables vanished. The Soviet state had accumulated enormous precious metal reserves, hidden in secret vaults across the country. When everything fell apart in 1991, vast quantities of gold, platinum, diamonds, and other valuables disappeared. Some was stolen by organized crime, some was taken by officials, some went to private accounts abroad. Estimates suggest billions of dollars worth of Soviet state assets were looted during the collapse. Where did it all go? Who has it now? Some of the oligarchs who became billionaires in the 1990s likely acquired Soviet state assets through questionable means, but proving exactly what happened is nearly impossible. The chaos of the Soviet collapse created opportunities for the largest theft in history, and most of it will never be fully documented. The Soviet Union experimented with weather control, and not just theoretically. They had programs attempting to modify weather patterns, create rain, suppress hurricanes, and even researched whether they could weaponize weather. The most documented example is cloud seeding to ensure clear weather for important events. For the 1980 Moscow Olympics, Soviet aircraft seeded clouds before they reached Moscow, making rain fall elsewhere to guarantee sunny weather for Olympic events. But there were more ambitious projects that remain partially classified. Did the Soviets develop weather weapons? Some defectors claimed yes, saying there were programs attempting to create droughts, floods, or temperature changes in enemy countries. Proving what's real versus paranoid speculation is difficult because the Soviet military classified everything. What we know is they took weather modification seriously and invested significant resources into it. The mystery of Soviet underwater bases sounds like science fiction, but is at least partially real. The Soviet Navy built secret submarine bases inside mountains and coastal caves. Some were carved into rock, accessible only by underwater entrances. The largest was the Balaklava submarine base in Crimea, built into a mountain with tunnels allowing submarines to enter and exit secretly. The facility could survive nuclear attack and house thousands of personnel. What makes this mysterious is how many of these bases existed and where they all are. The Soviet military built secret facilities across the entire country, and many locations remain unknown or unacknowledged. Some are abandoned and empty. Others are still in use by the Russian military. The full scope of Soviet underground military construction is still being discovered. Here's something absolutely verified, but still hard to believe. The Soviets had plans to blast a giant hole through mountains using nuclear weapons to divert Siberian rivers southward. The project would have created artificial seas larger than countries, redirected major rivers, and changed the climate across Central Asia. Multiple nuclear explosions would have been required. The environmental damage would have been catastrophic and permanent. They almost did it. The project had official approval and was being planned seriously before Gorbachev finally canceled it in the 1980s. Imagine if they'd gone through with it. The amount of hubris required to think you can redirect continental river systems with nuclear explosions is staggering. But Soviet planners genuinely believed they could reshape nature through brute force. The Soviet program to drill the deepest hole on Earth is another bizarre achievement. The Kola super-deep borehole reached over 40,000 feet below the surface, deeper than anyone had drilled before or has drilled since. The project lasted from 1970 to 1992, with scientists trying to reach the Earth's mantle. They never made it, but they discovered unexpected things. Water far deeper than should exist, microscopic fossils at extreme depths, and temperatures higher than predicted. What makes it mysterious is what they might have found that wasn't publicly announced. The project was partially military funded, and some findings may remain classified. There are urban legends about drilling breaking into an underground cavity where equipment recorded screams, which is obviously nonsense. But the real science was weird enough without inventing things. The fate of Lenin's brain is a genuine mystery. After Lenin died in 1924, Soviet scientists removed and preserved his brain, then sliced it into thousands of sections to study it. They created an entire institute dedicated to studying Lenin's brain, searching for the neurological basis of genius. The brain slices were stored in carefully controlled conditions and studied for decades. Where are they now? The institute still exists in Moscow, supposedly still maintaining the collection. But what exactly they have and what condition it's in remains unclear. Some researchers have been allowed limited access, but the full collection hasn't been independently verified. The Soviet obsession with Lenin extended to preserving pieces of his brain in the hope of understanding revolutionary genius, which is simultaneously fascinating and creepy. Soviet subway systems, especially Moscow's metro, have secret tunnels and stations that aren't on public maps. Some connect to government bunkers. Some were built for military purposes. Metro 2 is the code name for a secret parallel subway system supposedly connecting Kremlin to important government facilities and providing nuclear bunker access. The Russian government has never officially confirmed its existence, but enough evidence exists that most experts believe it's real. How extensive is this secret subway? Nobody outside classified circles knows. Maps don't exist publicly. Entrances are hidden. The workers who built it were silenced. This means there's literally a shadow transportation network under Moscow that the public cannot access or even see. Modern urban explorers occasionally find abandoned tunnels or bricked-up passages that suggest the scope is larger than officially acknowledged. The Soviet Union conducted psychological experiments that would never be allowed today. Sleep deprivation studies, isolation experiments, interrogation technique development. Some of this research was done on political prisoners without consent. The KGB and military both ran programs investigating mind control, behavioral modification, and psychological torture techniques. How far did these experiments go? What did they discover? Most records remain classified in Russia. What's been revealed suggests some truly disturbing research happened, but the full story hasn't been told. The ethical violations were massive, and modern knowledge of psychological torture techniques partially comes from this Soviet research that absolutely shouldn't have happened. Here's something recently confirmed. The Soviets had a secret nuclear reactor facility that contaminated a huge area, and they covered it up for 30 years. The Mayak facility in the Ural Mountains had a massive radiation release in 1957, contaminating over 20,000 square kilometers. The Soviets evacuated villages, but told residents it was for other reasons, never mentioning radiation. The incident wasn't publicly acknowledged until 1989. People lived in contaminated areas for decades without knowing why cancer rates were high and children were born with defects. The Soviet government knew but chose secrecy over public health. The area remains contaminated today, though nature is slowly reclaiming it. The full health impact will never be known because the Soviets destroyed or classified medical records. The mystery of what happened to captured Nazi scientists gets dark fast. The Americans took German rocket scientists and other specialists through Operation Paperclip. The Soviets did the same, but talked about it less. They captured German scientists, engineers, and technicians, bringing them to the USSR to work on weapons programs. Some went willingly for good pay. Others were forced. What happened to them after they were no longer useful? Some were eventually released and returned to Germany. Others disappeared into the Soviet system and were never heard from again. The full list of who was taken and what happened to them remains incomplete. The Soviet military classified these programs heavily, and post-Soviet Russia hasn't released all the files. The final mystery is how much we still don't know. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was brief hope that archives would open and secrets would be revealed. Some files were released, providing glimpses of previously hidden history. But the Russian government quickly reclassified many documents. Military and intelligence files remain sealed. The FSB, successor to the KGB, keeps most of their records secret. This means vast portions of Soviet history remain unknown. How many people actually died in the Gulag system? What were the full capabilities of Soviet intelligence? What happened to missing persons who disappeared into the system? Where are all the bodies buried, literally and figuratively? These questions have partial answers at best. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years, controlled territory spanning 11 time zones, and affected hundreds of millions of lives. It conducted massive secret programs in nuclear weapons, biological weapons, space exploration, psychology, human experimentation, environmental modification, and a dozen other fields. Most of what happened was never documented publicly. What was documented was often classified. What's been released since 1991 is incomplete and heavily redacted. So, yeah, you think you know the Soviet Union. But these mysteries suggest we only know a fraction of what actually happened. The rest remains hidden in sealed archives, classified files, and memories of people who aren't talking. Some mysteries will eventually be solved when documents are finally released or declassified. Others will remain unknown forever because records were destroyed, witnesses died, or governments decided some secrets should stay buried. That's the real mystery of the USSR. Not any single incident, but the sheer scope of what we still don't know and may never know about what happened behind the Iron Curtain.